to the Real Talk Cyber podcast. So today, we were thinking about different ideas, and one of the ideas that came up was how to measure cybersecurity success. Ultimately, we agreed to this together. What had you specifically agree to this topic? Are you seeing this topic come up a lot in your day-to-day?
I think that one of the hardest things to come to grips with is if we talk about what failure looks like, you have to have a measurement or a goalpost for what success looks like, right? Because how else are you able to quantify that you actually failed? So going back to the topic of last week, I think that it's the next logical conclusion of everything that we want to hit. Plus, I think that it's very, very, very difficult for a lot of people to understand the nuances. Is it just if we don't get breached, does that mean we have a successful program? What are some of those other nuances? So I think it's a very healthy conversation to have.
You know, I think one of the biggest trip ups that people make is they start with metrics instead of starting with a vision. And, you know, it really comes from this element of control. I fall into this trap all the time, Des. You know, when we first met, I was immediately looking at ways to measure and, you know, those different elements. And I think that setting a solid precedent with this topic is going to be critical, because I think everyone always wants to go to this place of measure, measure, measure when they don't have a clear defined end state. And so they don't necessarily know what they're measuring for. And so I think metrics in many senses can create a negative culture if not approached properly. Does that make sense?
No, I understand exactly what you mean. I always say that the first thing that you have to do when you're building any type of program whatsoever, when you're standing up a business vertical, is number one, you have to have a 3 to 5 year plan. And that 3 to 5 year plan should align to the business, to all the other verticals that are dependent on you or that you are dependent on. It should all be related within the organization. So you use that as that top line to say, like, all right, cool, this is where we're trying to go, right? And it's more vision based. And once you understand that and you have the strategy built out, that is really the first level of, are we successful? Are we not successful? Because if we strategize everything that we do from a cybersecurity perspective through the lens of the business and through the lens of technology, and what their strategy is, and we accomplish the things that are related to that or that support that, then organically we're going to find way more success, because number one, what have we done? We've done my favorite thing, which I always say is enable the business, because that's what our 3 to 5 year game plan was to start. And we've already, put all of our efforts and everything together.
So, I mean, I guess the first piece to metrics is make sure that you're building the metrics off of a 3 to 5 year plan. So make sure you have a plan first, and then once the plan is built, then you can kind of take a step back and start looking at each area and milestone and determining what are the best metrics for this phase. When it comes to some of the visions you've seen out there, you know, in a lot of situations, when a client has a vision, they probably also have begun to start talking about metrics. I mean, for you, Des, where are the common trip ups that you see in the marketplace when they have a vision and then they start the conversation around metrics, but maybe don't necessarily measure the right things, or maybe they don't even talk about metrics? I mean, what have you seen out there for those far and few between customers that do have a vision when they're coming up with metrics?
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny because one of the biggest things that you typically see is metrics in cybersecurity is one of the hardest things, because most people don't know what to actually measure, right? Obviously, there's some things at the tactical level that are relatively straightforward to measure, especially if you're talking about security operations, right? So you could say, all right, what is our mean time to, recover, our MTTR, our mean time to, contain a threat, our mean time to recover, like different things like that, right? Those things are nuance baked into the tactical level day to day. Where you really need and where you really start to see the trip ups happen is at the operational and at the strategic level. That is more or less when you start looking at it like, all right, cool. When we're looking at, these are the things that we're trying to accomplish from a technology perspective, Have we implemented any solution that has streamlined that in any way, shape, or form? If security reviews, let's say if security reviews has been a manual process for every developer that wants to push code into production, right? Are we able to implement a tool, or are able to implement automation that's going to automatically do that security scanning, right? That's more of at the operational level, right? Because now what I've done is I found an efficiency that we can then offer to our technology partners, more or less, right? That's a metric I would want to know. How much faster are we able to do these things now? That velocity and that scale then helps the business, right? And now we can start to measure, all right, now how fast are features coming through, other things like that. A lot of times when we're thinking about security, we think of it in that silo. And I think a component of it has to be at the tactical level. But I think there's larger strategic level initiatives that need to be hit too, especially when you start talking about business resilience specifically. And when we start talking about other metrics in regards to that, that we can obviously talk about if you want to go more in detail on.
So it seems like there's two different types of metrics. You kind of have your high level universal metrics, and then it seems like that piece that you talked about earlier with automation and with streamlining a specific initiative, you have other metrics that measures initiatives. Is that kind of how you would break it down? Is you have kind of these universal metrics, and then you have individual, more initiative-based metrics that are measuring the success of an initiative?
So the way I look at it typically is you have the metrics that are your day-to-day metrics. Um, those are things that you're going to look at. Like I say, if you have to do code reviews, if you have, you know what I mean, incidents that get opened up that you have to investigate, those are things from a security perspective. Those are very nuanced things. Those are, this is what it is,
Yeah.
right? There are larger, more organizational wide impacts that as a security leader, you should be looking for those efficiencies because you should be looking to implement security throughout and engineering and throughout the entire process, engineer it throughout all of your, you know what I mean, technological workflows, the whole 9 yards, right? So by adding that security that we've always talked about, you're ultimately building those additional efficiencies as well, right? And then also you would want to say like, hey, by implementing this security, we now have less amount of this, less amount of that, right?
Yeah.
More or less. Let's use a specific example. If the security team is responsible for, you know, pushing, let's say, standards around backups, right? On one side, and this goes into the dual mandate of everything I always talk about. On one side, you have backups from the perspective of if you go through a ransomware attack, right? Are we able to recover our systems right back to the point in time
Yeah.
before that system was compromised, more or less? The second aspect of it too, though, right, is all right, if we have data backups, then this also, whether we have an event that doesn't have anything to do with a cyber event specifically, maybe it's just, you know what I mean, we turn around, we have a issue with capacity and your application goes down, and now you found yourself in a point where things are still happening, right? But now you have to find a way to now recover your system. Is that data all lost, that right in that time period? So when you start talking about like your RPOs and stuff like that, your recovery point objectives, there's nuances there, right? Those are more metrics that are going to hit a broad array of processes, a broad array of technology teams, and
Yeah.
they're going to be impactful for the security team as well, right? Because at the end of the day, your mandate is always going to be protect the business, enable the business. And you could see just in an example like that, there's going to be two nuances to that. So I like to look at security through that lens in its totality, right? I look at it like, all right, cool. We have metrics that's going to be around us, our protection of the business, going back to our mean time to detect, right? Our mean time to contain a threat, right? How fast from we know it's a threat to how fast we actually turn around and contain that threat, right? But then you're going to have those larger business enablement pieces, which I start looking at saying, okay, what is your recovery time objective? You know what I mean? Like, what is your, you know, recovery point objective? Right? And starting to think about those things, right? Okay, we're implementing this tool here. What is the efficiency that's been added? based on that, right? We're pushing for more logging tools. Are people able to find issues
Yeah.
within their applications faster on the development side, right? Because we have that, right? So there's a lot of nuances that you should be looking at. And I think that a lot of times we cut our scope down and narrow it down to just the protection piece, that we miss all of those other nuances as well.
And there's probably metrics that you measure for maybe not for short time periods. Like for example, like in the situation that you just illustrated with backup, RTO and RPO, maybe you have an initiative per your vision that you have a certain recovery time and recovery point objective. And so maybe for a brief time period, you measure your current state and then you put in place a new solution to improve that current state. And for that brief time period, maybe you focus on those two metrics in a little bit more detail until the initiative is completed, and then you kind of go maybe put it back in like the maintenance category. Is that kind
Yeah.
of the typically way how you're distinguishing between kind of these maintenance metrics and these initiative-based growth metrics?
Well, that's an interesting perspective that you bring there, is like kind of conceptualizing it from, hey, we have metrics here that we're looking at just from a project base or initiative base. I think that's slightly different
Yeah,
in cybersecurity, because most of the things that you can get to the point where your security program is in a flow of maintenance, I could say. You have the tools that you want, you're working through the things the way that you want them to. And so from that point, it's like, hey, let's keep doing what we're doing. And then let's deal with these initiatives as spent up by the business to continue to enable them. I do think that's a healthy state that we should all be pursuing, right? So I think that's one nuance. I think that in cybersecurity, what makes it a little bit more tricky than that is there's always the possibility of dealing with the security incident itself, right? So more of a
yeah,
short term, hey, I'm looking at this thing right now. Those are things that we're looking at consistently, right? It's even in maintenance, or even when you're driving an initiative, you are always trying to look at the same things, because those same things always flow back to that idea of, if we have a breach, what does this actually mean? And are we predictive of that, right? So yeah, we could focus on our time to recovery, right? Our recovery time objective. That could be one thing that we're really driving on, because we really want to build out our business continuity plans. We want to have
yeah.
redundancy. We want to, right, all of these nuances. We want to have training, tabletop exercise. We want to test our ability to do it. We have that part. That doesn't go away, even though that's the number one focus, once we feel comfortable with that. That's still something that we always come back to and that we're always working through. That's why it's one of those things where when you really start to look at all of the nuances that go into it, you start to understand that security isn't one of those things that you ever just set and walk away from, right? It's
Yeah.
always going to be that maturation, because when you do have the concept of, hey, we're going to do this, and this is true of technology in general and likely true of a lot of business processes as well, you find yourself in a position where you end up with this thing called drift, right? Whereas, like, there's a difference between where we were when we initially did this and where we are now today, right? And that drift can happen for a broad array of reasons. How do you solve that from a technology perspective? Is you have to solve that through, really ideally, through automation and through staying up to date with it, because that's the most logical way in 2026 to really deal with it from a technology perspective, and not manually do it. However, you have to keep your finger on the pulse of those things, because really, by understanding those metrics, you have your finger on the pulse of the business and what's actually important to them. The business wants to be able to continue to function irregardless of whether it's a cyber threat, irregardless of whether or not, you know what I mean, we're having issues on an application side. The business wants to be able to function irregardless of all of that, right? So you have to then think about it from the perspective of, what do we need to drive and what do we need to pay attention to? What do we really need to understand, so that we can make sure that we have the appropriate metrics to tell the story to the business of, what are we actually doing to ensure that we keep you at that, 1 hour RTO, right? If that is the, set defined by the business. Or when we look at it and we're able to look at the financial component of it, we know every hour we lose, you know what I mean, $100,000 as a business of downtime, what is that tolerance that we're able to accept? And then us building everything towards that, from a security perspective and really just from a technology perspective in general.
I, I mean, this may be um, a differing opinion, and it may not work from the cybersecurity sense. But one of the things that I've seen happen in cultures, and it isn't just cybersecurity cultures, it's holistic cultures, is these leaders will have this great dashboard, which I think is excellent, right? I think in any situation, it's good to have visibility on what's going on and what's not going on well in your business. Now, one of the things that I've noticed is they get so focused on this dashboard that the dashboard starts to be their compass for their day-to-day activities. And so what happens is one metric will maybe go down. You know, maybe they'll have a ransomware event and they'll be like, oh man, like, you know, our RPOs are not high enough or our RTOs are not high enough. And I think if you don't have some sort of differentiation, what it can turn into is a reactive based culture where you're acting based on the metrics versus the vision. And I've seen this happen in my business as well, where we have these metrics and we're operating almost in this survival state of, hey, this metric's low, let's fix this. Like, this metric's low, let's fix this. And where we've lost sight of is the broader initiatives that long term will result in metric improvements. They won't be immediate. And so I think in some senses with any culture where you're building things, that can be kind of a watch out where, hey, if you're noticing that all your day-to-day is coming from these metrics, your whole day-to-day should be coming from your vision. And then, you know, the metrics are kind of secondary to keep the boat afloat. So I think that's one thing that I found that may be different in the cybersecurity realm. I'm not 100% sure, but I have seen that risk happen in, you know, other departments in the broader company strategy.
Yeah, the key is you have to just be able to explain the difference in the metrics, right? So, for example,
Yeah.
if we don't have any alerts built, right? No alerts built in our EDR platform. We don't have no metr- we have no metrics at that point, right? Every
Yeah.
time we add an alert, guess what's going to happen now? You're going to have more alerts. Guess what's going to happen? The time to
Yeah.
resolve is going to go, right? You see what I'm saying? So just introducing that's a security enhancement that initially just us getting the data is the win, right? Those other metrics could go up
Exactly.
though, right? And then what you have
Yeah.
to do from there is you work it as you understand the environment and you say, okay, now we understand how to work this. This is what we need to do. Now you put yourself in the position where you can reduce that time. And the way you reduce the time is, all right, now we can automate this away. We know how to work this. We have a playbook already built for how we do this every single time, right? But the first step is honestly to get the logging in place, to actually get the alerts built so that you know what's actually happening so that you can actually take that step. So I do think it's an appropriate example or an appropriate insight based on all the things that we're talking about here. It's one of those things that I think you really have to keep your mind open to, because a lot of times you can become so metric driven that you are you're losing track of what the data is actually telling you. And that's a skill and an art in and of itself, right? You have on one side like metrics that they're not stagnant, right? They tell a story, but you have to understand the various components of the data and being able to put the data together to properly tell the story. And that's also a thing where a lot of times people struggle. And I don't think that's a difficult problem to solve. I think that having an in-depth understanding of your business and what you actually do allows for you to be able to tell that. Like, hey, yeah, well, we had way more incidents last month because we redefined what an incident was. You know what I mean? Before, we didn't
Yeah.
capture all of these 30 things that happened like once a week. Now we capture all 30 of them so that we can turn around and we can, kill out what alert fatigue of our team, and we're going to start to build things to make those things go away. Or actually, based on the trends that we're seeing, and this is another thing from a metric perspective, based on the trends that we are actually seeing, this is how we should be thinking about technology going forward. We could solve this security problem and this technology problem and this business problem by doing this thing here. is that feasible, right? And talking to the business and other technology leaders to really figure out what that looks like, right? The idea overall, though, is when you start thinking about really being driven for success from a security, from the perspective of a cybersecurity program, your biggest thing should be, as an outcome, to reduce the friction between the business and security, right? If you do that appropriately, then you're going to onboard vendors faster. You're going to, you know what I mean, have better client experiences. You're going to have less executive fatigue or fear going into incidents and other things like that too. And then overall, you're going to have a security team that is, predictive, right? And not completely reactive. They're predictive of what's going to happen, predictive of where we're going to get hit, predictive of where we'll fill it, predictive of all of the dependencies, the secondary, the tertiary effects of the thing, right? And this is one of those things that, especially when you start thinking about other things, the enhancements that come from it, is not just base looking down on a sheet of paper, seeing this is how this is going to shake out. There's a lot of additional nuances that we're able to understand by actually looking at the data the way that we're talking about here today.
Yeah. And you brought up another point too, because you kind of brought up business metrics, and we really haven't we talked about cybersecurity metrics, but not business metrics. And I think that that's an important distinction to have as well, because I think a lot of times IT leaders are focused more on department level metrics instead of the broader metrics that impact the overall business vision and strategy. And so in many senses, that also creates a challenge communicating the progress that your specific department is making, because you're communicating the progress in terms of IT metrics instead of the metrics that everyone else cares about, which I think for a lot of these IT leaders would get them a lot more respect. At the end of the day, IT is unique. You're really, in many senses, helping every single department fulfill on their mission and their objective and their vision. And so you have a unique opportunity to create metrics that aren't just metrics for your department, but metrics for everyone. And you kind of alluded to some of those metrics, being a business enabler, like, hey, we are going to create an IT environment where we are going to enable business that our competitors can't even have, or some vision like that, where all of a sudden your metric becomes, hey, how many competitive deals did we win because of our IT security posture? Because we were the only one that was SOC 2 compliant or CMMC compliant. Or another metric when it comes to app uptime, how much app uptime do we have that we were able to save X amount of money in business downtime? And maybe that's another vision that an IT organization could have, to be the most uptime driven IT environment out there, or they'll have the least downtime of any manufacturing industry out there. And so you just start to see, when you have these visions that tie to the broader objective of the company, all of a sudden these business metrics start to reveal themselves. And these business metrics are the metrics that the CEO cares about, your head of sales cares about, your head of operations cares about. And all of a sudden, I think this is where these IT leaders start to get a seat at the C-level table.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with that. I think that one of the things that we oftentimes don't talk about, is really when we start talking about ROI. I always tell everybody this is my favorite metric of all time is ROI, return on investment. By me putting this in, what do I get back in return, right? And there's two pieces to it. If you are a organization, let's say you've never taken security serious, and you look at ROI and you like, well, technically I'm losing money because now I'm spending this in order to do that, right? You're not considering the other nuances of, well, just you spending it doesn't mean that, on the back end, now this is something that you're ultimately losing, right? Because this is something that you're supposed to do anyway. This is something that is a cost of doing business. Just because you didn't accrue the cost, or you've made the decision to not actually accrue the cost, doesn't mean that it's not a legitimate business cost that should have been spent the entire time, right? So I think there's a balance that needs to be figured out in regards to that too. However, for the piece that the technologist or the C-suite executive could look at, that I think is super duper valuable of it is, all right, cool. Because we've implemented these solutions, these tools, and all these great things, what does that actually mean? Right? Because we pass that PCI DSS audit, we're able to take credit card payments. We were a driver in that regards, right? The ROI on that could be infinite. How much ever money we made, right? Or if we were to outsource that responsibility, how much would that have cost us in return, right? And looking at that nuance, right? It's the same thing when you think about CMMC, right? Same exact component. How many contracts are we able to now compete for because we actually went through, got the assessment and passed, right? And I mean, HIPAA, I always say, right? Like, in order for you to even be in the space, you gotta abide by it. So you can see the security and compliance side of it, and just you being able to satisfy those requirements, that's the starter to get you in the game. That's the starter to get you in the game, right? Just to be able to do business, right? And that's true of every other, you know what I mean, regulatory responsibility you have, depending on your industry that you have to do. Like, right, when I was working in energy, we had NERC, right, and other things like that. You have to comply with that in order to do business. If you don't, then you're just in a bad spot, right? There is no business for you to do. And I think that as a leader, you have to be able to fully express that, define that, and then you're able to find those other things on the day to day. Like, hey, honestly, if we didn't implement these solutions we had, I would have needed an additional 10 people in order to actually monitor our environment. Right. If I didn't bring this managed service provider on, this would have been overnight coverage. This would have been overtime. This would have been this. This would have been that. Now, obviously, it's the business decision, and the business is right to say, well, we wouldn't pay that anyway. Right. That's not something that we value. Well, that's a business risk decision. That's something different. But again, I always say deciding to not pay the cost does not then like delegitimize the responsibility towards the outcome of it, right? At the end of the day. So it's one of those things where you understand those various things. And now you have to express to the business, all right, because we were able to do these things, this is what the outcome was. This is how much we were able to, get back into a developer's time because they didn't have to manually, review for vulnerabilities in their code, right? That's also going to help us when it comes time for us to sit down and do our PCI DSS audit, right? That's also going to help us. You see how we're kind of working this through now, right? These things, if you combine them, now you're able to really tell the story. Metrics are those few pieces. The data's surrounding data is what actually tells the story. Once you have that and you understand the business, now you're able to properly talk through those things like return on investment, what metrics matter, what are the most important things, and ultimately what actually does security success look like in our environment.
It's astounding to me, but I would say only 10% of the individuals that I talk to in the IT space actually know what their downtime metrics are, which I think is like common sense. That's like why one of the core reasons why IT is there is downtime metrics. But just to conclude, like my thoughts, I think that what's really important is that IT leaders recognize. I think they just don't. They're not thinking big enough. They don't realize that they're really the multiplier amongst everyone else. You take your IT department and it can be a 2x, a 3x, a 4x on what everyone else is doing if it's structured properly. And so I think that there's a huge opportunity for every leader to really start to think about what their vision is and then start to build initiatives and metrics tied to those initiatives to make progress towards that future vision. And I think that if just 10% of the world did that, overall businesses would be 2x, 3x, 4x more effective and efficient. Des, do you have any closing remarks as we close this out?
No, man, I think that sums it all up, man. I think ultimately we have to really start to map out what success is going to look like so that we can properly, review what our wins look like, what our losses look like, and where our improvements are. So I love it.
Nice, man. Good stuff. Well, thanks for joining the pod. We'll see you guys not next week, but the week after next. Be sure to
Perfect.
like and subscribe. I'll see you guys.
All right, peace.